Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales. And this time, I will be talking about the Vikings in Ireland. The Vikings in Ireland. Well, to begin with, there's a slight inaccuracy in terminology, since it would be better perhaps to say the Old Norse in Ireland, if one is looking at the whole history of that era, since the Vikings, well now, you see, they were only Vikings at the start of their time in Ireland. After that they were simply, settlers, townspeople, eventually becoming natives of this island, having intermarried with the Irish and converted to their religion. Their Vikingness, if you like, having been discarded decades previously, something I'll come to later on. In this video, I'll be looking at Ireland in those times and at the considerable influence on and the legacy, the lasting legacy in this country left by the Vikings, or the Norse, if you prefer. It forms a significant part of Irish history, impacting almost every aspect of life in Ireland and combining with Gael, Norman and Saxon to produce the Ireland of today. Without the Norse contribution, Ireland would be a different country today. Yes, it would certainly be different. Perhaps only slightly, only slightly, but different nonetheless. Well, for example, most of Ireland's major towns were founded by the Norse, not by the native Irish, including the capital, Dublin. The year is 795 AD. The place is either the island of Lambay, lying just off the east coast of Ireland near present-day Dublin, or Rathlin Island, which is further north, off the coast of Antrim. It isn't quite clear which, since the Annals of Ulster use a word to describe it which could mean either location, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter which. The event itself is what is important, not its location. Strange ships have appeared off the coast. Long, narrow ships with a single large square sail and a bank of oars. Ships that almost seem to ride on top of the water, to glide over it, rather than plough through it. These are quite remarkable ships. They have colourful round shields hung along the sides, and on the high prows are ferocious-looking heads of dragons or sea serpents. These ships bear no resemblance to the trading or fishing vessels that frequent the little coastal towns and villages of Ireland, though by now they are a very familiar and most unwelcome sight across the water in Britain. They have come from the north, from the lands of Scandinavia, principally Norway and Denmark, sailing first to the Shetland Islands, where they settled, and then to the Orkneys, establishing another settlement there. From there they have now sailed around Scotland and down the Irish Sea, landing on the Isle of Man, or Mona, as it was called. And now, having put up a settlement there, they are turning their attention to the west, to Ireland. And they have not come to trade or fish. No, they carry no nets nor boxes of trinkets to offer the natives, no amber or exotic furs to exchange for goods. They carry swords and fearsome axes. The Viking longships, the fearsome dragon ships, have arrived, bringing with them the finest warriors of the early Middle Ages. So, it is 795 AD, and the Vikings, they storm ashore on Lambay, or Rathlin, take your choice. They loot the church there of all its valuables, and then they burn it along with the other buildings, quickly returning to their ships and putting back to sea, setting a pattern for events to come. But these raids, with their attacks on churches and monasteries, that is a prominent feature of these raids, churches, monasteries being attacked. That has given rise to a popular misunderstanding about the motives of the Vikings, often seen as indicating that the pagan Vikings hated Christianity and were trying to destroy it by attacking religious institutions, wipe it from the face of the earth. But that isn't really the case, and that's the first thing I'd like to talk about here, since it is a frequently misunderstood and misrepresented aspect of the Vikings in Ireland, or indeed elsewhere too, for that matter. While they might have rather despised the Christians, I suppose, seeing them as weak, their turn the other cheek and love thy neighbour ideas, well, that would have seemed very lame against the strength of Odin or Thor, who would have bashed your cheek in instead of turning theirs. But by and large, the Norse weren't really interested what other people believed, just as long as those people didn't try to make them believe the same thing. Attempts to convert them by force would have ended rather badly. Though peaceful efforts by missionaries were another matter. And those missionaries to the Scandinavian countries were usually either treated quite politely or they were simply ignored. The pagan Norse never having the convert or die attitude that the church often did, mainly because they had no interest in converting other people, and as we shall see, they often coexisted quite happily with Christians and eventually converted without any pressure on them to do so. Well, at least here in Ireland. That wasn't always the case elsewhere, where many forcible conversions did occur. Excuse me. But as to the raids on religious sites, both in Ireland and in Britain, most of the wealth, you see, in Christian lands was held, yes, by the church. The monasteries and the churches, well, they were filled with gold and silver objects and precious jewels, to say nothing of bejeweled vestments, chalices, crucifixes, and monetary donations from wealthy patrons, or even poorer people hoping to buy a front seat in heaven, you might say. Oh, yes, yes, a nice fat donation to the church got you a front row seat for all eternity, which was also, of course, rather beneficial to the church as well. And monks and priests were among the few people who could read and write in those days, making them very valuable captives who could be sold as slaves. So, of course, that is where the Viking raiders went. Why would you raid a penniless fishing village where you might get, well, a lot of fish and some women who probably smelt like fish, when there was a wealthy monastery nearby full of gold and silver, offerings of coins and hack silver, jewel-encrusted artifacts, expensive garments, and valuable slaves to be had? Excuse me. Bishops and archbishops often had far greater wealth than the kings they served. And somewhere like, let us say, Winchester in the English kingdom of Wessex, the archbishop's palace would probably have had a lot more wealth in it than would the palace of King Alfred the Great, seeing as how that gentleman gave most of his money to the church rather than to his own people. So, just as a burglar today targets the home of an obviously wealthy person that will have, valuable contents, rather than breaking into a rundown, dilapidated dwelling with dirty curtains and broken windows that, clearly contains nothing of value, so too the Vikings went where the money was. Had the Jews or the Muslims, let us say, possessed all the valuables at that time, the Vikings would have raided synagogues and mosques, and they would have ignored Christian religious buildings altogether. They would have just walked straight past them. And then we would now see them just as incorrectly as hating Islam and Judaism instead of Christianity. I think that's quite an important point to make. In 798, they returned to the east coast, raiding the petty kingdom of Briga, which corresponded to the modern-day counties of Meath, Louth, and Dublin. And another raid takes place in 807, this time on the Atlantic coast in Connaught. Further raids occur on the west coast of Ireland, including the monasteries at Inishbofin in Galway, Inishmurray in Sligo, and the Skellig Islands. Also in 807, Roscam in Galway Bay was attacked, and a slave raid took place in 821, when a great many women were abducted from Howth near Dublin. Bangor was attacked in 823, and the monasteries of Clonfert, Birr, and Clonmacnoise in 842. The Irish annals actually name some of the leaders of these early raids. Saxilfer in 837, in which year 60 longships sailed up the rivers Liffey and Boyne, carrying 1,500 men and travelling a considerable distance inland. Thurgester in 845, who established forts deep inland on Loch Ray, Loch Nay, and Loch Neen. And an island in the latter actually still bears the Latinized version of his name, Turgesius Island. And he sacked the wealthy monastic settlement at Clonmacnoise once more. Clonmacnoise got sacked quite frequently. And then there was Håkon in 847 AD. In the late 10th century, there was even a fleet under the command of a woman. Yes, a woman. One of the later Irish annalists referring to her as the Red Maiden, who was said to have been even more ferocious than most of the men, and regarded by the Irish as one of the most dangerous of the Viking leaders. Her savagery greater than that of the men. Of course, that may have been a tad exaggerated for propaganda purposes, we don't know. But it does tell you something about the Red Maiden, I think, and also that raiding and fighting wasn't just confined to men. There are at least 2 historical accounts of female raiders commanding their own ships, as well as references in the sagas that show that the concept of females fighting in battle was accepted. Yes, the shield maidens did exist, though not quite in the way they are presented in the Vikings TV show. No, that is, well, very much an exaggeration. And funnily enough, the term shield maiden only occurs once, I think, in the sagas. Though there are very many accounts of women fighting in combat, proof that the concept of women fighting was accepted. It's also something that's often not really realized. The coastal raids intensified, as did attacks that took place far inland, with monasteries being the favourite targets, such as Glendalough, Clonard, Lismore, Munsterbois, Ferns, Kildare, Clondalkin, Slane, and in 852 AD, Armagh, the religious capital of Ireland, was destroyed. The Norse people's superb shipbuilding skills gave them this ability to reach inland areas very quickly, since with a draft requirement of no more than 3 feet, the longships could easily sail up even quite shallow rivers, giving them access to areas that would probably have considered themselves quite safe from seaborne attack. If you lived far from the coast, near a shallow river, well, you had nothing to fear. I mean, no warship would be able to get near you. That was just so obvious, you know. Are we at risk now? Are we at risk now from these Norsemen? Of course not. Sure, there's nothing to worry about, lads. We're perfectly safe here, sitting beside this little bit of a river, so we are. Sure, you can walk across that river and only get your arse wet. Safe as houses we are here, lads. Yes, no. Well, sorry about that. No, you're not. The depth of a wet arse was all that a Viking longship needed, as many towns beside shallow rivers were to discover very much to their cost. Now, the Norsemen began to build fortified encampments, establishing what were called longports around the coast, where they could safely berth their ships, carry out repairs, and so forth, thus enabling them to raid from there and to remain and winter in Ireland rather than returning to their bases in Britain or Scandinavia if they chose to do so. The first of these were a Norwegian camp on the River Liffey, where modern Dublin now stands, and another one at present-day Annagassan in County Louth. Now, you know, a very interesting note about this latter location, Annagassan, is that a Viking was said to have been left behind when they finally withdrew, missing the boat, quite literally, in his case. But apparently he was happy enough to stay where he was, and he settled down there, and, rather surprisingly, apparently the local people had no objection. Local tradition telling of a seafaring man of Scandinavian appearance and very large, mythic proportions, it was said, who lived in the village and was nicknamed the Bear. Other encampments were set up at Leixlip, Clondalkin, Strangford, Youghal, Arklow, and Carlingford. The first record of the Vikings remaining for an entire winter in Ireland comes from Lough Neagh, 840 to 841 AD, followed by a permanent settlement that grew into a town on the River Liffey, which they called Difflin, the name coming from the Irish Dove Linn, the dark pool, named after a sort of inlet from the River Liffey, which formed a ready-made anchorage, and that settlement would then later become Dublin. And they spent the winter of 841 to 842 there. Strangely enough, there were actually two towns side by side. There was the Viking Dyflin, close to the mouth of the river, and an Irish town called Arclea, the ford of the Hurdles, which lay further upriver. Despite various Irish uprisings and occasional periods of control, the Norse managed to more or less control Dyflin right up to the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169. Though by that time they were indistinguishable from the native Irish due to assimilation. Ironically, of course, the Normans were themselves descendants of Vikings who had settled in France several centuries earlier, which is where their name and the name of Normandy itself came from, originally being known to the Franks as the Normanni, or the Northmen. Even before some of the longports had become actual towns, trade had been established. And that was typical of Viking expeditions elsewhere as well, since trade and settlement were often as important as raiding, and frequently more so, and of course less costly in casualties. And once these grew into proper towns, that aspect of the Viking occupation became paramount. Fighting still occurred, of course, between them and the various Irish chieftains and local kings whose domain lay outside the areas controlled by the Norse, and that fighting would go on for decades, with both sides victorious, depending on who had the greater strength at the time. The Vikings happily slaughtering the Irish one day, and the Irish just as happily slaughtering the Vikings the next, as well as clashes between rival Viking groups. Oh yes, the Vikings fought each other as well. That's something I think a lot of people don't seem to realize. See, they're usually seen as the Vikings, which gives the impression they were all on the same side, fighting as one. Vikings, Irish. But they weren't. They were not one unified force under one leader. They didn't even all come from one country, being Norwegians and Danes. Maybe a few Swedes thrown in as well, though Swedish raiding was concentrated to the east. And they comprised a number of factions but that would vie with one another for power or fought over blood feuds and the like. Blood feuds were quite a common thing, and some of these feuds probably having actually started back in Scandinavia, and then they were brought to Ireland and continued over here. You had you killed one of us, so we will kill one of you, and then you kill two of us to avenge our killing one of you, so then we go, we probably killed three of you, because this could just go on and on, and these things would drag on. So when they weren't fighting the Irish, they were often fighting each other with equal ferocity. A battle occurred, for example, in 851 AD in Dundalk Bay between rival Danes and Norwegians. And it's interesting to note that it wasn't always just Irish versus Viking or Viking versus Viking either, since there surprising alliances developed between the invaders and the local people. The famous saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, well, that certainly applied on a number of occasions here in Ireland in those days. For example, around 1169 AD, the Viking king of Waterford entered into an alliance with Brian Boru's brother, Machan, over king of Munster, which is a rather ironic alliance, I suppose, in view of what would happen a few years later at Clontarf. And the Viking kings of Dyflin made brief alliances with several Irish kings in order to avoid having to fight on two fronts while raiding and fighting across the Irish Sea in Britain. It was much better to have Irish friends at their back rather than enemies. There were other alliances, some only temporary, while others lasted, depending on circumstances and how much value either side could get out of the alliances. Many Irish leaders also realized the financial and social benefits to be had by alliances with the Norse, given their remarkably efficient and widespread trading activities, bringing in goods from Britain, from Scandinavia, from as far as the Mediterranean, products the Irish had no easy access to in any other way. National pride took second place, quite often to political or social expediency, and trading relationships quickly developed, which in turn led to a personal interchange of ideas and aspects of each other's culture. That in turn led to marriage in many cases. The popular image of a constant them versus us, that's really quite incorrect in the context of Norse and Irish relations, especially once the Viking settlements became permanently established. once they became towns, and their raids into the countryside diminished, thus reducing the chances of conflict between the Norse and the local Irish. You weren't really going to have flashpoints, if you like, if you were going and offering goods in exchange rather than arriving with an axe in your hand to take something. I think a lot of that, had to do with the fact that very few Irish petty kings and chieftains would have seen an allegiance to Ireland as a country. No, their allegiances were to their own little kingdoms, which caused any number, of course, of local wars between them as well, fighting each other for power and land, as well as fighting the Vikings. And once those Irish chieftains discovered that the Vikings were not going to conquer the entire country, and thus threaten their own little bits of it, the advantages of trade and profit for themselves, plus the considerable benefit, of course, of having the Vikings as war allies if needed, outweighed other considerations. Saving dear old Mother Ireland from the invaders was not their concern, as long as their little parts of it remained unthreatened, and it was other chieftains who were suffering, especially if those other chieftains just happened to be enemies of theirs, which was very good, of course, and trading relations rather than fighting. Well, that was obviously the best guarantee of preserving their own lands without loss to themselves. And the Vikings, of course, were perfectly happy to get what they wanted without having to fight for it. You don't take casualties when you're trading. And, of course, acquiring valuable allies into the bargain, plus being able to live more securely in their settlements, able to concentrate on everyday things like farming and raising families, rather than constant warfare, always having to be ready to defend themselves against attackers. It is worth noting, by the way, that once the Vikings had settled down and established towns, the people living in those towns were, strictly speaking, no longer Vikings. No, though we tend to refer to them as the Vikings, but they weren't. They were simply Norse, or you could call them Danes or Norwegians. The term Viking, or Vikinger in Old Norse, only applied to one who got in a ship, went somewhere, and did something or other when they got there in the ship, be it raiding, trading, exploring, or, well, simply scratching their ass as they watched the scenery go past. But once they were settled residents of a town, not having anything whatsoever to do with ships or raiding, just ordinary people going about their normal domestic activities, farming, craftsmanship of all kinds, having children, and so on, they were no longer Vikings in the proper sense of that word, even when they fought against the Irish. No, it's even when they fought against the Irish, as long as they were just settled people defending their town, for example, not leaping off ships to do it, they weren't actually Vikings. They were simply settlers, townspeople, fighting off enemies. Now, I suppose it's a subtle difference, perhaps, but it's true nonetheless. Though I suppose we are stuck with the term Vikings, given its popular though incorrect usage. And of course, nobody called them Vikings at that time. No, they were Norsemen, heathens, pagans, Northmen, and a lot of very rude names too, I'm sure. But even the Vikings didn't call themselves Vikings, because while they could go Viking, they couldn't be Viking. It wasn't a term of nationality, it was an activity, it was something that one did. Like, a man who drives a truck is not a truck. He simply drives it. Olafur the White became king of Dyflin circa 853 AD, reigning jointly with a very famous Viking indeed, perhaps the most famous of all Vikings, certainly the most famous Viking in the history of Ireland, his kinsman Ivar Ragnarsson, better known as Ivar the Boneless, or Ivar the Boneless, supposedly the son of Ragnar Lothbrok and Osloch, well known, of course, to any fans of the Vikings TV series. He ravaged County Meath to begin with. He was rather good at ravaging things, actually, plundering Celtic tombs, such as those in the Boyne Valley, and he was involved in no little conflict with the native Irish chieftains as a result, who were a bit peeved about things like that. But in 865 AD, he made alliances with some of the local Irish chieftains. Then he and Olafur left Dyflin, along with Ivar's brother Ubba, to lead what became known as the Great Heathen Army, along with a number of other Norse leaders, including another of Ivar's brother, Halfdan, to conquer much of Britain. Now the Great Heathen Army was the largest Norse army ever to land in England until Harald Hardrada in 1066, and the most successful, eventually gaining the Norsemen full control over most of that country. They captured the city of York, or Jorvik to the Vikings, in 866, fought their way through Mercia and wintered in Nottingham in 868, and they defeated King Edmund in East Anglia in 869. Olafur had returned to Dyflin fairly soon, with Ivar himself returning to Ireland in 871, a few years before his death. He was said to have died around 873, though it's a bit hard to be sure. And he left the Great Heathen Army to continue fighting in England for several more years. Its success, I'm sure, considerably due to Ivar's military abilities. Ivar the Boneless founded the greatest of the Viking dynasties in Ireland, or really anywhere else, I suppose, for that matter, known as the Eilif, meaning the descendants of Ivar, though the title included Ivar himself and his contemporaries. And he would have derived considerable wealth from the slave trade, there being enormous profits to be had, both from the international trade in slaves itself, often sent as far as Constantinople, and from the heavy taxes levied on it. He was described as the King of the Norsemen, of Ireland and Britain. A very modest title that he may have actually given to himself. Well, yeah, why not? Clearly he deserved it. And he was considered a brilliant military strategist, something the television show does actually portray correctly, about the only thing they do portray correctly. He could indeed include Britain in his claim. That was not an exaggeration, since the Norse kingdom of Dublin included a considerable area along the west coast of Britain and Scotland, as well as the Hebrides. Whether or not he was actually crippled to any great extent, that is a matter of debate, given his military prowess. And he was described as being a very large man, standing well above others in height, and a very capable warrior. There really is no way to give a definite answer, given the conflicting accounts of him, nor are there any Anglo-Saxon reports of anyone ever meeting him and describing him physically, though I'm sure many Anglo-Saxons did meet him. How many were still alive afterwards to talk about it, of course, is another matter entirely. Some saga accounts describe him as having weak bones, or cartilage instead of bone, and having to be carried around. Though the Ragnarssonaforta, the tale of Ragnar's sons, that suggests male impotence, that his bonelessness was simply figurative. And in that case, tales of his physical handicap may well have been an attempt to hide that fact. It would have been very embarrassing for a mighty warrior to be unable to, perform. So tales of weak bones might have been preferable to the truth, if that was the truth, which is itself questionable, I suppose. Though Ivar did exist, unlike Ragnar Lothbrok, who was seemingly a combination of several men, and his brothers Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, and Ubba are also historical figures, a great deal of Ivar's story is, it's partly historical fact and partly saga storytelling, which may or may not be correct. That a cripple who might need to be carried around and couldn't move properly could become a great and feared warrior in the 9th century, with its emphasis on strength and fighting ability, something rather hard to do if one was being carried around on a shield just firing arrows at people. That seems highly unlikely, to say the least. Would warriors follow a cripple, a man who couldn't even fight hand to hand but just had to sit on that shield and fire his arrows? I really can't see that happening. It does really seem extremely unlikely. But regardless of whether he couldn't walk properly or he simply couldn't get it up, as they say, we will now leave the fearsome Ivar in Bainlausi and continue with the Viking activities elsewhere in Ireland, which are considerable. However, try to control your burning desire for that, because, I'm sorry, that will have to wait for part 2 of this video. Yes. And in part 2, I will be looking at more Viking facts and dispelling a popular myth, among other things. So, watch this space, as they say. There will be more. Until then, I shall say farewell and goodbye until Part 2.